Okay, so I am Claire Burkett. I'm a recent graduate here at SPU with a degree in philosophy. And this afternoon, we have Julie Yonker once again coming from Calvin College. And we have Laird Edman, who is here from Northwestern College in Orange City, Iowa. That one.
Although we've gotten a lot of mileage out of going to conferences with the tag that says Northwestern and lots of vendors like bend over backwards. All right, our study, Priming Analytical Thinking, does not diminish religious belief. Or as Jim Cresswell's title, a little more saucy title is, let's give religion the respect it deserves. So this study is Julie and I and Jim Cresswell and Justin. Nani was in kind of at the beginning discussions on this. It kind of came out of some discussions last year at Calvin, and we're going to talk about stuff you already know. System one, system two thinking, you already know about this. We are cognitive misers. Our cognitive systems are very efficient, partly because there's just no way we can reflectively consider all of the decisions we make. We do not have the cognitive resources to do that. So the vast majority of our decisions, the vast majority of the processing that goes on in an intuitive, very quick, possibly unconscious way. So system one thinking, that fast, automatic, unconscious, minimal effort. So it's frugal heuristics, it's cognitively efficient, it just feels right. So you're walking down a sidewalk, you see people coming towards you, there's a number of different people in some different groups. You are automatically analyzing those faces. You're not thinking about it, you're not saying, I wonder if that person is going to hit me or not. You're glancing at faces, you're analyzing for friend or foe, friendly or not, do I know these people? The person next to you says, say, do you know that person over there in the red? And you go, oh yeah, that's Justin Barrett. I kind of like him. He's got really quirky humor. He's very fun. All of a sudden it shifts to system two. You have to sort of process. You have to think. So system two thinking overrides system one when analytical thinking tendencies are activated and cognitive resources then become available. It's not an either or, it's a both and. Our thinking uses both of them and it's how we work, but system two can then kick in and override system one. So belief in supernatural agents may be intuitive. This cognitive science of religion then connects religious belief into system one thinking. So it's not exclusively, of course, and we heard from Bob McCauley last night, and we've heard from Justin, and you've read a bunch of stuff. But perhaps one of the reasons for the ubiquity of religious belief is that it's tapped into the system one intuitive automatic thinking somehow. It's natural. We're apparently born believers. So it feels right to us. So how does that then interact with system two thinking? If you prime system two thinking, does that then suppress religious belief? If you snap someone into system two thinking, does their religious belief somehow affected by that? Can individual differences in religious belief be that easily manipulated? We just prime that system one and they report different levels of religious belief than they would have, or prime system two and they report different levels of religious belief than they would have if you hadn't primed system two thinking. Well, that's the proposition. Gervais and Norenzayan, April 2012 in Science, big deal because it got in Science. Analytic thinking promotes religious disbelief. That's the title of the article. They posited that religious belief is tied into system one thinking. At least that's part of what's going on. And so they thought, well, let's look at what system two thinking does to religious belief. So they applied this dual process model of cognition to the problem. And then they said that their hypothesis that analytic processing promotes then religious disbelief. So they did a bunch of studies. They found that in study one, individual differences in the tendency to think analytically was associated with increased religious disbelief. People who thought more analytically were less religious. That was sort of their study one. Study two, then, they had people looking at the thinker, or looking at Discolobus. Discolobus not being priming in, analytic thinking and looking at the thinker priming analytic thinking. And then they had people answering questions about religious belief, and look at that. The people who looked at the thinker reported less religious belief. Then they rearranged sentences to make sense, but some of them had analytic words in them, and some of the sentences didn't have analytic words in them. They did another study using that one again with a little larger sort of, not just students in the Canadian university study, and then they did a final study where people read the directions in a degraded font, the theory being if you read something in a degraded font, it forces you to stop and think about what you're reading, primes analytic belief, and in all of their studies, they indicated that if you prime analytic thinking, it reduces religious belief. So that's what they said. But there are other researchers who say, well, analytic thinking as a sort of a personal variable, a dispositional variable, is connected to religious disbelief. So Penny-Cook et al., 2012 in Cognition, individuals vary in beliefs based on their propensity to think analytically. They examined associations with God beliefs, religious engagement, conventional religious beliefs, paranormal beliefs, with performance measures of cognitive ability and analytic cognitive style. The results, analytic cognitive style negatively predicted both religious and paranormal beliefs when controlling for cognitive ability, as well as controlling for religious engagement, sex, age, political ideology, and education. And so the association between analytic cognitive style and God beliefs is more nuanced, they said, than simply acceptance and rejection, but it also includes adopting less conventional God beliefs, such as pantheism or deism. So even people who share cognitive ability, education, political ideology, sex, age, and level of religious engagement, those with higher levels of analytic thinking had different, less convergent religious beliefs. Or then, Shenhav, Rand, Green, 2012, Journal of Experimental Psychology, divine intuition, cognitive style influences belief in God. Sort of many of the same findings as the Penny-Cook et al., that individual differences in cognitive style predict belief in God. They use the cognitive reflection task, the same task that Gervais and Norzan used, the same task that we used. They said that participants who gave more intuitive answers on CRT, the cognitive reflection task, report stronger belief in God, and the effect was not immediately mediated by education level, income, political orientation, or other demographics. And that belief in God also holds, this correlation also holds when cognitive ability and aspects of personality are controlled. So, okay, these are fascinating studies, perhaps problematic. The Gervais and Norzan raised a lot of eyebrows. It was kind of interesting, but dang, what happened when the Gervais and Norzan came out? Bam, it hit the popular media hard. What we have here is a Google search of analytic thinking and religious beliefs. It says 1,210,000 results. This is actually old. I just did it again 2 days ago. It was 2,200,000 something results. And the results over and over are referring to Gervais and Norzan, Gervais and Norzan, Gervais and Norzan. And as is typical when the popular media grabs hold of a research study, they perhaps aren't reporting it with the greatest of nuance. But it's not just the Huffington Post or CNN or Fox News who are reporting it in a truly goofy way. The American Academy for the Advancement of Science, the headline they had on their website, "To keep the faith, don't get analytical." Scientific American, which granted seems to delight in mocking people with faith. Scientific American's headline reporting this data was, "How Critical Thinkers Lose Their Faith in God." And then they reported this study. The study didn't say either of those things. It just didn't. As a matter of fact, CNN did quote someone who said, you know, okay, this study makes the story we need to tell about religion and religious belief all the more complicated. That's what great scientific research does, asks more interesting questions, so we have to keep looking. That's Bob McCauley. So, what we wanted to do, okay, so we decided, let's see if we can replicate their findings. Let's take a look. We had questions about their sample, perhaps, some questions about whether we could find the same thing using the same methods. Because, I mean, our response was, really? Does that work? We wanted to have an experimental model to test the priming effect of several other cognitive tasks. Okay, if the cognitive reflection task primes analytic thinking, and if analytic thinking, system 2 thinking, is what we think it is, then these other tasks that they didn't use should also do it, and we would like to do a little manipulation check. So we used the CRT, which they used as their priming analytic thinking task, or one of their main ones, but we also used several other tasks, a Stroop task, associative conjunctive primes, and we added a control condition. Hello. So, 3, we wanted to include measures of thinking styles to examine individual differences. So, kind of combining some of the stuff that Gervais and Norenzain did with the stuff that Pennycook and the other people did, say, okay, let's look at thinking styles, analytical thinking styles, need for cognition, faith and intuition. Let's see how these things interact with the effect we get from the priming. And we wanted to examine religious affiliation with religiosity and thinking variables. We know that religious belief is complex. It varies greatly person to person, so we wanted to test the relationship of religious affiliation with the relationship of thinking variables and religiosity. Do the primes work better or less well with religious people or non-religious people? And then finally, we wanted to talk about science beliefs. Because one of our thoughts is, well, maybe what you're priming isn't religious disbelief, it's just intellectual humility. And so it doesn't matter what you're then testing later. Do you believe in this? Maybe they're going to not believe as much in that. And if the analytic primes do work, then people's science beliefs, which, as we know from Bob McCauley, require system 2 thinking, those should go up. So that was what we were interested in trying to do.
Good. All right, so I'll tell you a little bit about then the studies that we conducted. So we did 2 studies, which again were experimental in nature. All the other studies that Laird gave you as background were correlational. So we know obviously the gold standard is to do random distribution of experimental studies. So the first study we also conducted with college students, but this time we did it at a Christian college, so evidently at Calvin College. And so again, just the definition of priming, any task that precedes a subsequent activity, that subsequent activity is affected because of what was done previously. Also, part of the reason why we thought this was important for the background that Laird presented to you, also a letter came out this past September, October in Nature from Daniel Kahneman saying, hey, some of this priming stuff, we suspect that the results may not be as influential as people make them out to be. And so that's why one of the reasons where we think it's important to reproduce these results if we can do that. Again, the CRT task, just so that you can see what that example is, intuitive response would be to answer that it costs 10 cents, but the correct answer is that it costs 5 cents. And then we included a Stroop task as well, inhibiting that intuitive response. When you read this and say when you say the color ink, you have to suppress that intuitive response to actually read the word letter. And so again, just to show you the priming tasks and the alphas associated with them, these are after priming, these are the tasks that were used. Gervais and Norenzain used those as well. We used the similar ones, but then we also used this need for cognition, faith, and intuition, and then we asked for some demographic variables. Again, you can see this was randomized, experimental. effect, we can see we had a relatively decent distribution, a little bit less in the Stroop condition. Again, a little bit more female, but again, college students, and then their native. The other issue, you may sort of say, well, why did you ask about native English speaker? One of the things we suspected when we discussed this study as a group last summer was that it was conducted at the University of British Columbia, and we suspected that there would be a high number of non-native English speakers in that particular population. And when you're reading something in your second or your third language, just in general, you tend to be a bit more analytical. And at Calvin College, we have about 25% of our student body is international. And so we wanted to control for that variable as well. So we asked about native language that one spoke. So you can see we have that difference as well. Okay, so when we look then at these differences between the control and the CRT with respect to all the religiosity variables and the faith and intuition, we get, and we control. So again, we did all our analysis straight away with controlling for variables that we thought could have an impact: gender, age, education, religious affiliation. Again, we asked them to say what religion that they were affiliated with, and native English speaker. When we controlled for all of those things and redid this analysis, we found a significant difference on intrinsic religiosity, where the control group actually scores lower than the two conditions, where one was analytically primed. Okay, so we thought, okay, this is a bit interesting. But we saw with the faith and intuition that the CRT, when you're sort of primed analytically, you have less faith in intuition, but you also have, for some reason, less need for cognition in this particular group as well. So we also asked them with respect to science knowledge, and this was the science knowledge task that we used. Some of these statements here are scientifically correct. Some would be more intuitive, that one might answer this from a more sort of naive scientific basis. So we had some that were correct in both instances, correct in only the naive, and correct in other ways. We did not see any difference between any of our conditions on that science knowledge or beliefs task that we used. Okay, so then we did another study, and again using Mechanical Turk as Daniela had used, and so looking at then a much broader distribution of a national sample. So we were able to get about 550 participants in each condition. We again used the CRT, we used the Stroop, we used the analytical conjunctive prime, we used the degraded font and the control condition as well. And as Danielle had said, there was Qualtrics randomizes all of these, and we got a nice distribution. We limited ourselves to North America, whereas you got it from a little bit more. And we actually paid a whole lot less, or more than you did. We had a shorter time span that they needed, and we paid more. So anyway. The analytical conjunctive prime task, one of them is the traditional Linda question. Most people will say, because of these characteristics of Linda, that she is most likely active in the feminist movement, whereas the correct answer due to probability is that she's most likely a bank teller. And we had another similar one that we used. We also used the card task that Bob had showed last night as well, and two variations of that. And then just so that you can see what the degraded font condition looks like, that's what it looks like. So, you know, you are going to have to kind of squint and really think and work hard to read. And we also had some sections too where people could give comments about what did you think this study was about, because then I haven't analyzed all of those, but we did kind of look at some of the responses, and everybody who did this one, they either commented in the response or they emailed us to say, something's wrong with your screen because it's not very bright or something. So like, yes, we know. So again, you can see the participant characteristics here, the distribution, nicely distributed, pretty well distributed, because you can tell Qualtrics to distribute it with respect to gender. The ages were in their early 30s. Everybody, most everybody had some college education. Our religious affiliation, actually we didn't have, and this was something that Justin had sort of questioned about this. We don't have that many people that are religiously affiliated, and so we kind of had some discussions among others who had done some of these mechanical Turk studies, and it sort of seems like the Turk workers, or Turkers as they're sometimes called, do tend to be not quite as religiously oriented. There was some social, we have a sociologist in our college who has done some mechanical Turk stuff, and that's similar to what he has found as well. We have a lot more native English speakers. There you can see the faith and intuition and the need for cognition. The degraded font scored much lower on that, but we'll look at that in just a little bit. Okay, so now here we have our overall results, and we can see when we look at all these conditions, we do see an overall effect here, where again, our control condition is scoring lower in their intrinsic religiosity, and the other ones, when we have these analytical primes, so to speak, they actually score higher in that intrinsic religiosity. We again see a little bit more faith and intuition with the control group, a little bit less need for cognition, but again, here's where that degraded font popped up a little bit more as well. So we were comparing with the control group, so all conditions were compared with the control group here. Then a couple other things that we wanted to look at to sort of tease out our results a little bit more was looking at that CRT task, because that did seem to be a good one, and again, because it was used in the science study, we wanted to look at that a little bit better. So we teased out and made high and low groups. So the high group is the one who got all of the answers correct, or 2 of the 4 answers correct, and then the low group got 1 or 0 of those correct. And so we've got the high and the low group, and when you compare them then again on the religiosity variables, there really wasn't a difference between those who do really well with analytical priming and those who don't do as well. There was no difference between those groups. But when we come to the science beliefs, okay, when we come to that measure, then we see a difference. So in this case, actually those who score lower actually did better on this science beliefs task. Again, we see a little bit of a change in the faith and intuition and the need for cognition. We see that as well. Then with respect to the religious affiliation, this is just sort of a graph to let you know, these were the categories that we gave people to categorize themselves where they fell, and the vast majority fell into the non-atheist and agnostic group. And so then we wanted to look a little bit is, could your religious affiliation have a contribution to how you responded to these different questions? So then we made 3 groups. One group was the non-atheist agnostic group, and then the other was the majority religion based on, in the US, what are the majority religions, so the Christian ones, Catholic and so forth, and then the minority religions would be the Jewish, the Mormon, the Muslim would fall under those categories. So then when we looked at these 3 groups and comparing those religious affiliations, as one might expect, we have with the intrinsic religiosity, the majority religion scoring significantly higher than those who profess no religion or are in the atheist group. But then we see then that the individuals who are non-atheist agnostic are scoring much better on the analytical thinking test as well. Again, the atheists are wanting more cognition and less intuition, and we see a little bit of a difference too between the different sort of religious groups on those scales. Okay, turning it over to you.
We're kind of going through fast because we know we can't hold your attention for very long at this point in the day. All right, so
You should make your slide frame so you're in progress.
degraded font in the slides. So these results lead us to conclude that neither religious beliefs nor science beliefs can be unidirectionally and reliably manipulated by priming analytic reasoning. We just didn't find it. Contrary to previous research, in Study 1, participation in priming tasks that inhibited intuitive thought, the Stroop, or required inhibition and analytic thought, the CRT, failed to reduce theistic or religious beliefs. In fact, participants in the analytic thinking task had elevated intrinsic religiosity scores compared to the control condition. So not only could we not replicate Gervais and Norenzayan, we got the opposite results. This is very strange. Ooh. So, it may be that the CRT priming does trigger more careful reflection, but that this extra reflection serves to amplify the thought tendencies of the population in question. Whereas the population sampled in the previously published study was relatively secular in orientation, the sample from study 1 was from Calvin, and the priming may have succeeded in bolstering the reasons for pre-existing thinking tendencies. Alternatively, maybe a research design that requires analytic thinking as a supraliminal prime, as you know, you're not aware that that's what is being primed, followed by a statement of religious commitments, actually may have induced demand characteristics. So maybe in the previous study, the Gervais and Norenzayan, the demand characteristics induced at the University of British Columbia would be, oh yeah, this is a psych, these are psych people, and I should be a little less kind of religious. And the demand characteristic at Calvin is, oh, I'm at Calvin, I need to say that my faith is intrinsic. And so that maybe what we primed were these demand characteristics. If analytic thought is indeed primed by the CRT task, and scientific thought, like the rejection of theism, requires overriding intuitions, we would expect such priming to elevate affirmation of scientific findings. We didn't find that when we were doing the science beliefs. Now, I have to say that we're still looking at the data. We're going to rescore the science beliefs in a different manner that may be more nuanced here. So that's still a little tentative, because we scored the science beliefs as total correct, assuming that that would wrap in how well they did at inhibiting the intuitive response, when the correct response was the scientific response, not the intuitive response. And let me explain again, these questions on the science beliefs, some of the questions were true intuitively and true scientifically. Rocks are made of matter. You know, intuitively, yes. Scientifically, yes. Some of the questions were false intuitively and false scientifically. Rocks turn food into energy. Wrong intuitively, wrong scientifically. But some of the questions were false intuitively and true scientifically. And some of the questions were true intuitively and false scientifically. So we have some questions where there's a divergence between the intuitive and scientific answer, and some questions where there's a convergence. And so the next round of scoring that we're going to dig into is looking at the difference between the convergent answers and the divergent answers to see if when you prime analytic thinking, are people better at the divergent questions? Have you slowed them down to think reflectively enough to get the divergent questions better? And so we're going to look at those different scores, and we haven't done that yet. Unsurprisingly, in the whole study, individual difference characteristics appeared to play a much more important role in shaping religious beliefs than any priming, but we really already knew that. Moreover, the results are contrary to those reported by mainstream media. More scientific accuracy shows a much more complex picture than previous research. Research on priming suggests that the processing mode of the individual tends to be sustained in subsequent decision making, rather than the priming changing the individual's beliefs. So that's where we are, and we will take your questions.
Were the available responses to the science questions yes, no, I don't know?
True, false.
True, false.
Okay, so what if a person didn't know the answer?
They
guessed.
either guessed or they left it blank.
Okay.
So, and then we also, the other thing too that Laird didn't mention is we do have reaction time. with that as well. And I haven't dug into that either because it's a little bit.
And looking at the latencies, again, that there may be that if you prime analytic thinking, then perhaps the latencies should show that when the intuitive response and the scientific response are divergent, they should slow down. And we're kind of eager to see, do they? Are people who've been primed have longer latencies on the divergent questions than people who haven't been primed? So that's another one of our questions.
And also, I guess maybe another thing that might, if you want to give us some advice, we were kind of deciding whether we should, how in depth we should go on the science stuff in this particular article with that we're hoping to submit to Nature as a letter, meaning it's relatively short. So we were discussing, should this be a separate paper in and of itself? But we'll see.
John?
I don't remember what the original article's measure was for religious belief that they said got.
Same ones we used.
It's exactly the same.
No, but I mean, is the science belief one, is it congruent? I mean, is it, because it seems like that's more science knowledge, whereas the other one, is it religious belief? Is that more, is religious belief more of an opinion thing, whereas the science knowledge is more?
And you're right. Saying science belief is misnaming that.
Yeah.
It's not belief in the accuracy of science. It's sort of knowledge of science and ability to suppress the intuitive response to give the right response.
On the stream task, since it was online, what were they actually doing, and how do you know they are actually engaging in
Yeah,
any intuitive
that was obviously a challenge with the Stroop task. So one of the first things was when they did that, if they got randomized to that condition, they first were to go and do a thing about color blindness to see if they were colorblind or not. If they passed yes, they were not, or no, they were not colorblind. Basically, then they continued on with the task. If they did come up colorblind, then they got randomized to one of the other conditions. But basically, it was something where they were advancing the screen. So they had the congruent items and they had the incongruent items, and they were advancing the screen, and we were looking at the time. But because we got timed on everything that they did with Qualtrics, it was looking like really we could only use the latency between the first 10 congruent and the first 10 incongruent.
But what were they asked?
They were asked to say out loud.
So you have no idea who.
Exactly. We
Because,
don't.
because with the Stroop test, the timed issue is how long it takes you.
Right.
That
Right.
you're slower to say the
Right.
correct response. So
Right.
if I'm just sitting there and not doing
Right.
anything.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we threw out those. We oversampled by, I want to say 150 to 200 on the actual Stroop task to kick out people that it looked like they were just binging the space
Well, I guess
bar.
my question is, how do
I
you
need
know
my
that
40
they
cents.
were actually suppressing their intuitive response? How do you know they were getting it
Right,
right?
we don't have any way to know that. But again, we're just assuming that it's a prime, so we're using it as a prime.
The manipulation check might be that we seem to get the same result on the Stroop test in the face-to-face
Right.
as we did in the online, or the Mechanical Turk.
Just a little question, that is, all I'm just saying is it's not obvious to me that priming analytic thinking would make people affirm science knowledge, which is, as was pointed out, the character of these questions. In fact, it might have, I guess I can easily enough kind of crank up a scenario that might be just the opposite. That is not obvious.
Yeah. And our results are the opposite.
Yeah, give us the explanation so we can.
Because you're many people. There's a kind of intellectual wariness once you prime these analytical considerations, right? I mean, Holden, I guess, had intellectual humility.
Yeah, that's right.
cautious.
Yeah, wait a minute.
I'm not sure.
I don't want to go with, yeah.
But actually, on a piece with that, Deb Kellerman's work with the teleological explanations, good, bad kind of thing, when she really finds up the time that people actually become, let's see, what is it?
Yeah. Promiscuously teleological.
They also tend to let second guess on the control items. Their accuracy in the first study changed too, and maybe for just these same kinds of. Sorry, when they're slowed all the way down, they actually their error rate was higher on the control items, the good answers, than when they went fast. So maybe for the same kind
Well,
of
sure, they're going, okay, I think it's
There's
that.
more
I'll
time to
bet
sort
this
of,
is a trick question.
think yourself out of it.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that what explains your results is that what you primed was careful thinking in a sense. And so they second guess themselves when they probably shouldn't have. And you'll find that when you look at the reaction time data, right? You said you have
We
reaction
do,
time data.
yeah.
Now, I completely forgot to do this. Jim, will you take notes?
I'm getting that. I could
I was
see he
supposed to
was not
ask.
taking notes, so.
But that doesn't mess up your argument because it's saying that, in a sense, they didn't prime anti-religious thinking. They just primed sort of more careful thinking.
Yeah, I mean, that was my first reaction when I read the Gervais and Orzane articles, that I don't think they're priming religious unbelief or disbelief. I think they're priming careful thinking. And I'm going to be a little bit less likely to endorse anything. Yeah.
So maybe,
Go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say maybe by throwing out the people who were super fast, I don't know what you used, but.
On the street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could have been throwing out the people who are best at,
Yeah.
best at,
Inhibiting those
inhibiting
inhibitions.
their intuitions. They're the ones who are able to do it really, because I do that in my class, and it's the students, always the best students who are best at doing it.
Right,
so-
I know, but we looked primarily at, I mean, you could look and see,
Right, but I-
immediately they were doing the test, bing, 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 bing. So I want my 30 cents.
They're brilliant.
No. Yeah.
2,000 of them.
Actually, I may have just missed this, so you guys said this, forgive me for asking. But what about this native speaker of English stuff? Did you actually report? I didn't
Well,
see
no,
it.
we always controlled. So we always put it in as a control. So we ran Mancova, so that was always one of the covariates in there. So we always controlled for that. Yep. Yep. Sorry, and I probably didn't stop to explain that.
Controlled for age, education.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and which is something that we did that
They didn't do.
they did not.
I don't know if you guys mentioned in the first study, right? It's not just the intrinsic religiosity measure, but some sort of affirmations of theism. We used
Yeah.
essentially all three measures that Gervais and Orzane used across their various studies. All of them were present in the first one. It's just only the intrinsic religiosity pops, right? Am I remembering
Yes.
that?
I would say
Correct.
just one.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just want to say that Julie gets 90% of the credit for this study. She did all of the work with the running the subjects at
Yeah,
at
so I just ran
Calvin
it, and then these
doing
guys
the
are
intern
interpreting
stuff.
it for me. So, like, here's your stuff, give me the story. But, yeah.
So will you be making any comment about the ready belief of articles that are published in Science and Nature when they have the greatest erratum rates out of any journals?
Oh.
And then make the comment that that's the nature of science?
I don't know. Like I said, we're kind of going with the competitor, hoping that they want to needle science.
Well, it's ironic that effectively the way the media has picked this up is exactly this sort of espousal.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the funny thing is, at the same time that Gervais and Orzane ran this thing, they were also shopping around their article that showed that if you've got a deficit in theory of mind capacity, that predicts atheism. They shopped it around to one of these big shots and could not get it in.
Yeah, they got it in +1, I think.
So it was in +1 is where it ended up going.
Yeah. We just open
And
access.
it was actually a much better,
I thought it was a
more
much better
careful
study.
paper.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, this
but
one.
it didn't fit a good narrative.
Yeah, this one in science is basically, I mean, our, basic intro stats students could run. It's just correlations. Okay. Yeah, exactly. We love Vancouver's. Okay, Myron, you probably are chomping at the bit here.
All right, you don't need this, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. I give you my permission to stand and just kind of shake around and high-five someone if you want. So anyway. Yeah, interpret it how you will. Fresh reading of the text. So I just want to say that it's been just a great day, and also yesterday just reconnecting with all of you who were participants in this seminar. I want to say thank you to Calvin College and the exceedingly fine summer seminars in Christian scholarship that they've been promoting. And it's just a real gift to the Christian scholarly community, and just certainly appreciate being able to participate in that. And the Murdoch people who've been funding this, and all you fine folk who've come out today. My interest in cognitive science of religion is as a philosopher and interested in teasing out some of the philosophical implications of this data. And so as a result of participating in the seminar and things that I've been reading and working on over the last while, I've come to think that 4 conclusions are true. And what I'm going to be doing today in the time that we have together is I'm going to, at the outset, give you what these 4 conclusions are. And then I'm going to be giving you a sketch as to how I think the arguments go in terms of supporting these conclusions. And we'll see kind of how far I get just before our time is done. All right, so one of the things I think is true is that CSR does not provide evidence for atheism. What we've seen in the literature, and this has been discussed in a couple of different contexts already, but what we've seen in the literature as philosophers have been engaging the work from cognitive science of religion is that often in many different situations it's just assumed that this really nice naturalistic causal story we have for why it is that people believe in gods is just taken to automatically support some kind of naturalistic atheism. And as philosophers are trying to understand what the arguments are and to try and tease out these claims into why we should think that that's the case, consensus seems to be converging, though it's still early, that there's really not a good argument at present from CSR to atheism. And I can certainly concur with that. Another thing that I think is true, and I think here I disagree in some respects with Justin, both on this conclusion and also the next conclusion that I'll be presenting, is that I do think that if you are an atheist, what CSR does do is it provides some kind of support for your atheism. I think it provides what I like to call intellectual aid and comfort. So if you come to the data as someone who does not believe in God, what CSR does do is it provides some kind of support for your atheism. It supports its intellectual viability. Another thing that I think is true is that I do not think that cognitive science of religion really can be used to support a viable theism, in the sense that it doesn't give what I call, or what you might think is neutral evidence to an honest inquirer. It shouldn't give, there's nothing about the CSR data that should cause atheists to lose sleep at night with respect to wondering whether their atheism is true. I don't think that CSR provides evidence for theistic belief. But I do think that if you are a theist, that CSR provides some support for Reformed epistemology, which we've been introduced to in a couple of different talks already. It's minimal support, it's modest support, it's not conclusive support, but I think that it is an interesting result, and I think Justin and Kelly Clark and others have pointed this out, that there are some interesting convergences between this theory that Plantinga got cooked up in his armchair 4 decades ago and some of the science that has been coming through today. So these are things that I think are true. So first one, CSR is not evidence for atheism. It's an interesting question in terms of how empirical science connects and may support to religious claims. There's a long, well-known history about how it is that empirical work supports or undermines various claims that people make about the gods. We're all familiar with this idea that astronomy provided strong evidence against what many held to be a religious claim of a geocentric universe, right? And so a very clear instance about how science connected with a religious belief. Geocentric universe wouldn't be a religious belief in the strict kind of CSR sense of a religious belief in supernatural agency, but more a religion kind of broadly construed. More to the point in current discussions, genomics provides evidence against the claim that there was a literal Adam and a literal Eve. Genomic science seems to be inconsistent with this idea that humanity descended from a literal pair. At no point in time does it seem like the human population could have ever dipped below 10,000. And so here we've got really strong genomic science that many that is rippling through, if you might call it, the evangelical world in different degrees. Now, well, where do we put CSR? I mean, CSR in this kind of trajectory is often taken as undermining the plausibility of religious belief. I thought about adding here too, I mean, in the same way that contemporary neuroscience is often taken as undermining the plausibility of some kind of dualistic view of human persons, right? It's just kind of assumed that the framework of our best study of mind and brain undermines the need for positing some kind of non-physical soul as intrinsic to human nature. CSR, I think, in the same way is often taken as undermining the rationality of religious belief. Well, so here's a question. I mean, how could CSR support atheism? I mean, what would it mean for this theory to provide evidence for the claim that there is no God, or that there are no supernatural agents, or that we live in an indifferent naturalistic world? Well, one route is through what we might call the route of confirmation or disconfirmation of theory by observation. And so it's just in the way that we have large-scale kind of theories or pictures of how the world is, and we go out and make observations, and in some instances, depending on the framework that you're using, your observation is going to support or disconfirm the theory. So could CSR support atheism in that respect? Another route that CSR could support atheism is through what we can call unreliability arguments, where CSR gives us good reason to think that the mechanisms that produce, sustain, underwrite cognitive processes that underwrite religious belief are really unreliable and should be mistrusted once we become aware of this unreliability. Well, with respect to route one, philosopher of science Elliot Sober, who has just written lots of really good stuff in philosophy of science, has this nice kind of shorthand version that he calls the surprise principle, which is just an accessible shorthand version of some more complicated principles in theory confirmation. But basically, the surprise principle is this. An observation confirms hypothesis 1 over hypothesis 2 if two conditions are satisfied, and only if the two conditions are satisfied. If hypothesis 1 were true, the observation is exactly what you would expect. And if hypothesis 2 were true, the observation would be, in fact, surprising. Then we can say that the observation supports H1 over H2. Well, let's apply this then to cognitive science of religion. And we might say that the CSR data then supports atheism, H1, over theism, H2, if and only if two conditions are satisfied. And the first condition would be that given atheism, CSR data is what we'd expect. And I mean, it's expectability is a somewhat subjective term, and there are different ways to kind of cash that out. I actually think that this condition is satisfied. I think if you're an atheist, there's a really good story to tell as to why the data that we actually find in the empirical work of cognitive science of religion is something that is not surprising at all. It fits a larger kind of story. And that could just be that I'm just ignorant of the data. But it just seems to me, as I read it, that there's a consistency and a fit there. But what about the second condition in order for the observations that we make in CSR? Is it the case that given theism, the CSR data is surprising? If you believe in a God who is omnipotent, all-powerful, perfectly good, knowing, loves you, has a plan and a purpose for you, is it surprising that we find the data in CSR? It'd be interesting actually to kind of poll you, and your perspectives on that. My own view is that the right answer here is, dun, 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 I don't know. And that's just because I don't know how it is that we go about making judgments about what we should expect to be the case if a being like that exists. I have no idea how to measure what it's like, the kind of causal processes it's likely to be observed, if God exists and wants people to form beliefs about the supernatural, right? I mean, I don't know how to measure that. So because I think we're at a loss here in terms of how to quantify the second condition, I think that this first route of using CSR to establish atheism is not, it's founders, right? So it's not a good way to support atheism using this kind of confirmation, disconfirmation. Well, what about unreliability arguments? And these kinds of arguments have gotten much more play in the philosophy of religion literature. And we might say, well, look, CSR data shows the unreliability of causal processes that underwrite religious belief, these cognitive processes. Perhaps because the proliferation of outputs resulting in religious plurality is a strong indicator that the mechanisms that are generating these outputs are not reliable, right? If they were reliable, this may be controversial, but it shouldn't be, but maybe it is. If they were reliable in the same way that the outputs of naive physics were, there seems to be convergence on other aspects of core cognition, but perhaps the fact that there's this proliferation of outputs in the religious case, that should cause us to be suspicious of their outputs. Also, there's what I call the ontological irrelevance of supernatural agents. And basically, the picture that we seem to have is that you can perfectly well explain the belief in gods without needing to appeal to the existence of gods. The actual existence of supernatural agents is ontologically irrelevant on CSR to the fact of whether or not people would turn out to believe in these beings. So these are two kind of ways of trying to establish these unreliability arguments. So just quickly here, with respect to proliferation of outputs, the fact that there are all these different ways in which people conceive of and think about the supernatural and supernatural agents, you've got this idea that wildly divergent outputs indicate unreliability. But I think that cultural scaffolding and the ways in which culture and cultural inputs and historical contingencies and all these other kinds of factors tune the operation of cognition that underwrites religious beliefs can really be appealed to account for this diversity, right? So it's not just, you'd have to do more than just say, well, look, there's all these divergent outputs, therefore the mechanisms that underwrite them are unreliable. It's a more complicated story to tell here, and I think that cultural scaffolding can be plausible. And in fact, I think one of the things that is remarkable about the CSR standard model is just not the diversity, but the striking unity that there is in this variety of empirical methods, whether it's developmental work or cross-cultural work, just the striking unity that appears from our cognitive architecture with respect to religious belief. So I don't think this is a good argument. With respect to ontological irrelevance, so the claim here is that CSR shows that the existence of gods is irrelevant to forming belief in gods. You might remember this from my talk last year, that when it comes to this particular point, I mean, Michael Murray and others have pointed out that, well, look, if you think that there's a successful natural theology, right, and that you need God to explain, why there's something at all, or you need God to explain certain other aspects of the world that we see, then you're not going to be particularly persuaded, because while it may be technically true that CSR shows that you don't need the existence of God to believe in God, to believe in God, narrowly construed, there are all sorts of other considerations that are relevant to bear here. So I personally I'm skeptical about the prospects for a successful natural theology, but I just want to bear in mind that this is the way in which a person can respond. But I think more successfully with respect to this notion of ontological irrelevance, there is, I think, a much more plausible and Jeff Schloss and Mike Murray have also sketched out the framework of an argument here. I look to develop it in more detail. But there's a sense in which, if ontological irrelevance means we shouldn't believe in something, then who among us can be saved, right? I mean, if we're brains in vats, we don't need the existence of tables and chairs to explain the existence of tables and chairs. We would believe them whether they exist or not, right? If our thoughts and beliefs and emotions are being plugged into our consciousness by our robot overlords, then we shouldn't believe in anything. But when presented with this kind of broadly skeptical scenario, I mean, people have different responses, but it's a very prominent response in philosophy to say, well, look, our common sense views about our experience of the world, unless we've got good reason to doubt, are perfectly justified. So there's a sense in which, well, look, the same kind of response that the fallibilist, common sense thinker provides to these global skeptical scenarios is also available when it comes to ontological irrelevance. So I don't think CSR is a good provides the tools to support atheism. But I do think that if you are an atheist, CSR gives you some aid and comfort, some support. Well, how could CSR add to one's atheism? Well, I think one way that it could is by undermining certain religious claims, right? If there are certain religious claims that should dislodge one's atheism, cause one to kind of hold it less tightly, and CSR can block those, well, then that's a way of supporting an atheistic perspective. I also think that there is some epistemic value in showing that atheism is consistent with our best science. I think this provides intellectual aid and comfort. Right, so here's a religious claim. The widespread belief in gods is some kind of indicator of a supernatural reality. Right, so a person might think that that's true, and an atheist might wonder about that. But what CSR provides is that, well, a ready response. Well, look, widespread belief in gods, you don't need to appeal to gods, right, in order to account for this widespread belief. We've got this standard model according to which belief in gods emerges from an underlying kind of cognitive process that can be very easily accommodated within a naturalistic framework. So, okay, so a little bit of aid. Let's see if we can get some comfort. Here's a claim. The best explanation, right? This is often appears as a claim made in first-year undergraduate philosophy courses at Christian colleges, is in my experience. Well, the best explanation for my strong sense that God loves me, that God is speaking to me, that God hears my prayer. The best explanation for or that, as the glossolalia example, that God is empowering me to speak in a prophetic and ecstatic utterance, right? The best explanation for that is that it's true, right? That it must be the case. Why else would I feel this way? Would I have these experiences? Well, what atheism, and so if a person's kind of wondering about that, well, what atheism plus CSR does is it says, well, look, what overwhelming amount of research shows is that religious experiences like insert can easily be the product of naturalistic cognitive processes that isn't necessarily veridical, right? And that's the key point here. So I think, if you are, I don't think that CSR supports atheism over and against theism. I do think that if you are an atheist, what CSR gives you is, some support for the intellectual viability of the bigger picture. And this is because, and I guess, so we got about a couple minutes? Okay. So what CSR does provide is a nice empirically grounded story of why people believe in gods that doesn't require their existence. It gives you a nice story to tell about why this belief is pervasive, cross-culturally recurrent, difficult to dislodge without requiring it to be true. And I think if you're an atheist, you should kind of look at that and say, well, okay, that kind of makes sense, right? I preach it. It would be troubling, I think, for an atheist if given developing cognitive science in general and cognitive science of religion in particular. It would be troubling if there was nothing like a remotely plausible naturalistic theory of religion, right? But there are, at least remotely plausible naturalistic theories of religion, and so the atheist needn't be troubled. What to say here in 2 minutes about point 3? Just this idea that CSR doesn't provide evidence for theism. Maybe just this slide. How could CSR support your belief in God, if in fact you do believe in God, right? Well, maybe one route would be to show that CSR data is inconsistent with a godless world, with naturalism, right? If what we know from CSR seems to be incongruent with a naturalistic perspective, then that would be one way in which CSR could support theism. Another way would be to show some link between maturationally natural cognition and reliable cognition, right? So this idea that, in many key respects, core cognition gives us not only adaptive beliefs, but adaptive true beliefs about the world. Why should we doubt it with respect to the operation of those belief-forming faculties and religious belief? Well, okay, so this kind of gets into some stuff that Justin and Ian Church wrote in the Monist edition, in which Adam's paper was also published. And they attempt to make the claim that, look, if you doubt the reliability of belief-forming faculties with respect to religious belief, then why would you doubt? Then you ought, that kind of commits you to doubting their reliability with respect to all sorts of other belief-forming contexts, because it's the same cognitive machinery that's in place. But so if you are an atheist and you're rejecting the reliability of these BFFs in religious contexts, you should be broad skeptics. And that's an interesting proposal. I actually don't think it's successful, but unfortunately I don't have time. Thanks for your questions. We'll see ya. So anyway, so that's kind of a sketch of the overall project. I went into kind of the first two parts of it, and I guess we have time for a couple questions.
Yeah. Let's start here.
Well, there's no good a priori argument ruling out that some selected for BFFs, belief-forming faculties, turn out to be both adaptive and reliable, right? So it's not like you just, as I took the Barrett Church thesis, is that, well, look, if you think that they're unreliable in the supernatural agent case, that seems to commit you to saying that they're unreliable in all these other contexts. And I think, it's, I'm just kind of skimming over this right now, but I think that there's an interesting story that the atheist can tell, or the naturalist can tell, as to why that's not the case.
Other questions?
John.
I hate to even comment on your project because most of the philosophers here, I feel like I hardly understand what you're saying.
But what about me, John? Do you understand?
But I understand you.
Okay,
I think we have this thing.
I'll high five you.
Yeah. Your first argument about that atheism. What was your first?
The first conclusion was that CSR does not support atheism.
Correct.
Yeah.
And you had the two different
two ways in which CSR
One is
could
that,
possibly.
yes, that the data can be explained by atheism, and the other one is that the data, in a sense, can't be explained very well, or it's surprising.
Which is more surprising.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you're either giving the atheists too much credit or not giving the theists enough credit.
Right.
Because I think we are all very good at taking whatever schema we have and taking the data and fitting it in to make sense.
As I've known, because it's what I've learned about psychologists, that if you don't like the answer, you just run the numbers in a different way.
Exactly.
Hey, watch
That's what I'm
So,
am I way off base in saying that?
yeah. Oh, I've known this is always
Well, and the reason I say that is I'm assuming you are a theist. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think we have the tendency in academia to try to overcompensate, to try to show that we're being fair, and so we, give our opponent more, leeway than we give ourselves.
So you're saying if I were a good theist, I should get that question mark out of there, right? And it should be like an X.
No, I guess what I'm saying is probably many theists could make a good account for the data that wouldn't be surprising.
Yeah, I mean.
But I don't think I know all the CSR data well enough to make that point.
Yeah, I guess, that's an interesting point, and I think that certainly certainly, there might be many who think that there's a good story to tell, that on theism it just kind of, follows that we would see this kind of, unreliable cognitive process that generates, wildly divergent beliefs and doesn't, give us. I mean, it's possible that there's a story. I don't. I'm open to having my mind changed about that. Yeah.
Yeah, Myron, I would really be interested in knowing how your, which was part of the presentation you didn't seem to get to a whole lot, is how your understanding of kind of reformed epistemology impacts your interpretation of the data to come up with the.
To come up with this?
To come up with your conclusion on that it's a question.
I don't know that reformed epistemology. I don't think you have to have one view or the other about reformed epistemology and to think that B is a question mark, right?
Okay. Because, the reason I'm saying it is that I think that there are theistic positions in which you could check the box too. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, Catholic epistemology, I think you could, looking at the data. And
right.
Again, I don't know all of the data, but looking at it, you could say that there are theological strains of theological thought in schools that would actually say, yeah, this is kind of what we would sort of expect.
Okay. Sorry. So that if the question were given theism, the CSR data is what we'd expect. There would be certain Catholic positions that would check the box.
It would check right.
Okay, well,
maybe with a question mark after it.
Well, that's a different way of framing the question. Then I mean, then the question is, does using this kind of a simple little surprise principle, does the observation, if we can call CSR data an observation, does it support theism over atheism? And then you're saying, well, on a Catholic epistemology, at least this first condition, given theism, the data is kind of pretty much what we'd expect. But then the second question would be, is given atheism, would the data be surprising? And I don't think you could get that. You might be halfway there, but you wouldn't get all the way home.
But then, I remember Justin saying he was speaking at a Jesuit college or university once, and afterwards someone came up and said, oh, you just look at the probabilities. Here's the data. How probable is it we would get this data if there is a God, versus how probable is it we'd get this data if there isn't a God? And I think we can say it's more probable if there is a God. And then that'd be a good Jesuit way of kind of thinking through it.
Yeah, I think
argument from probability, though, falls apart when one says, what do you have to do? What are the other possibilities with something that is that complex? And then the density of that explanation,
Well, I think the problem with a lot of probability arguments is that you get wildly different results depending on very small adjustments in the priors that you pump into the machinery, right? And we need a black book that tells us all the correct priors to assign to things, right? So,
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes.
I'm hardly a philosopher, and I might be getting this wrong.
You're in good company.
But I'm troubled by an assumption that seems to pervade the paper, and that is that methodological naturalism equals atheism.
Oh, I don't think that that's true. I'm talking more, when I use naturalism, it's not methodological naturalism, it's a philosophical naturalism. Right, so methodological naturalism would just be to say, well, look, when we do empirical science, we have to assume that something like naturalism is true, and it kind of directs and shapes how we proceed in terms of getting data and interpreting it.
But that's the only thing the scientists can do. What I'm suggesting is that the scientists really cannot go beyond methodological naturalism.
Right, and I mean, I think most days I'm inclined to agree exactly with that. I don't know that, but when I talk about naturalism in the paper, I'm not in any way suggesting that methodological naturalism should be abandoned. It's more, but there is kind of, I think, in a lot of circles, what I would say is a sloppy inference from the success of methodological naturalism as taking to support some kind of broader philosophical claim about philosophical naturalism, right? And I don't think that's right. Thank you.
Thank you, Myron. And